it just occurred to me that the living clearly don't have a clue about what just happened, so why don't we talk to the dead? And that was the initial seed. What if the dead could speak? What if the many victims of Sri Lankan's war were given a voice? What would they have to say about the country and what it did to them? That was the spark, but I wasn't, I guess, brave enough to write about 2009 because it was very recent history. So the passage I'm going to read from is one of Mali Almeida's chats with ghosts. He wanders around the afterlife while he's solving his own murder, talking to various spirits. In this case, he's at the top of an interrogation building, a torture house if you like, and he meets a dead priest and they have a conversation about the legacy of colonialism. Chat with dead priest. The outline shifts and the thing no longer looks like a priest in robe. It crouches like a hound and you see things hanging from its neck. I have watched you on that tree, Mr. Photographer. You know that there is no order to all of this. You have known it always. And suddenly the cold transforms into something familiar. Not something, perhaps more an absence of a thing, an emptiness that stretches to the horizon, a void that has known you forever. When your dear Dada departed, you ran through different scenarios every night while trying to sleep. Maybe he sensed you were queer. Maybe he wished you were him. Maybe you reminded him of her. Maybe he hoped you'd be worth more. You relived every sullen word, every petulant glance, every slight, every put down, until your chest was hollow. I live in Sri Lanka. I have been there for the last 10 years since I had kids, but if I look back on my life, I always spent time in Sri Lanka and then spent time overseas as well. So I was born in Galle in Sri Lanka and then spent some time in England, but I was very much a child or a teenager during the 80s when the war kicked off, the riots kicked off, and the time I'm writing about, I was about 15, and my family migrated in 1990 to New Zealand, which is where I finished my studies and went to college. Tried to write a novel in my 20s, not very successfully, as most 20-year-olds who start novels. And then I came back to Sri Lanka, so I lived there, most of the early 2000s. Worked in England for a while, but I was there during the end of the war, 2009. And then lived in Singapore for 4 or 5 years. And so I tend to get very disgruntled with the country and move out, and then when I go abroad I suddenly get ideas for novels and I end up finding my way back there. So it's been that sort of relationship. But yeah, at the moment I've very much in Colombo, and I was there we've had a very turbulent last 5 years, last 10 years, and so I've been able to witness that. And whatever said about Sri Lanka, there's plenty of material for novelists who are writing dystopian novels. The paradox is, how is this beautiful paradise island, which it is, full of these very smiley, happy people, how we've gone from tragedy to catastrophe throughout my lifetime. And if you look at the last 5 years, we've had economic crisis, we've had people on the streets, we've had a government fleeing, and but I wasn't writing about this period, I was writing about what I grew up with. So I guess we have two main ethnic groups or two main languages, the Sinhalese, who majority, 70% or thereabouts, and the Tamil minority. And these two groups have coexisted for centuries on the island, but right after we received independence in '48, there was a lot of divisive politics. And you see these ideas coming up every time there's election, the idea who the country belongs to, who are the minorities, who are the guests, and who deserves rights. And it was around language. And the Sinhala-only Language Act of '58, that really sparked a lot of resentment, which ended up in an armed movement. And it really came to a head in 1983 with the now infamous, notorious July '83 riots, which many look at as the start of the whole mess. And growing up, I grew up in Colombo, which was not really the war zone. I mean, Sri Lanka is roughly shaped like a palm, and I think the north and the east was where the war was happening. But even growing up in Colombo, it was a city of checkpoints, of curfews, assassinations, bomb blasts, and this is what I grew up. And look, it didn't make much sense to me as a teenager, and even after it ended, I guess this book was trying to make sense of it. But 1989 was, I remember, a particularly harrowing time because there were three different conflicts. There was the ethnic separatist war with the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. Down south, there was a Marxist insurrection with a lot of rural, working class, university radicals taking on the government, and the government cracked down on that. But also you had the Indian peacekeeping force, who was there to keep the peace, but also got embroiled with a war with different factions. So the reality of '89 was, going to school, you would see bodies on the side of the street, bodies burning on tires. This was, these are my memories of your mom telling you, don't look that side, look this side, and you'd ask curiously, who was that person? Why were they killed? And there wasn't always an answer, because it could have been anyone. It could have been a suspected terrorist, it could have been a member of the armed forces, and there was a lot of unsolved murders during that period. But that was my way of making sense of what we lived through. You feel it, do you not? That is the energy. The hollowness and that loathing were not entirely unpleasant. Despair always begins as a snack that you nibble on when bored, and then becomes a meal that you have thrice a day. Who do you blame for all this mess? Was it the colonials who screwed us for centuries, or the superpowers who are screwing us now? There is a terrible scream from down below, and the roof spits out black shadows, which the dead priest sucks up through what looks like a large straw. Writing in English, I would say in the 90s is when it really came to a global stage, with Michael Ondaatje winning the Booker Prize for The English Patient, which is not really about Sri Lanka, but most of his early writings were about his childhood there. And you had Ramesh Gunasekara, Shyam Selvadurai, a lot of writers who were doing well on the global stage. But what I found was, and that was this time I was starting to write, a lot of writings about Sri Lanka were very much an outsider view. It was either someone, a Sri Lankan who'd lived abroad and come back, and there weren't too many insider views. And when I started writing my first book, which was a very different book, it was about a forgotten cricketer and two old men who were sports fanatics drinking themselves to death. But I just thought, this is a story about, it's a very Sri Lankan story, but it's a very insider view of the kind. It was set during the war, but it doesn't mention the war. So I think that's something I tried to portray, like to be able to write a uniquely Sri Lankan story in a uniquely Sri Lankan voice. And I think around that time where the Ondaatjes and Gunasekaras were writing books, there was another gentleman called Carl Muller, who's not very well known outside of the subcontinent. But for me, he was a great influence because he wrote about the Burgher community. So this is the descendants of the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British. And I guess the one community that hasn't been involved in violent conflict in our history. And he was just writing a story about a Burgher family who are stereotypically what we say eating, drinking people, happy-go-lucky. And so it's just a bawdy comedy about a family who were getting drunk, having fights, having affairs with each other's spouses. But it was written in it's like a Sri Lankan drunken uncle telling a story. And for me, that opened up a lot of doors, because I think growing up, when you read Sri Lankan writing, especially in the 60s and 70s, it was almost like we were trying to sound like Englishmen who lived 100 years ago. So a lot of writing tried to sound like Graham Greene or Hemingway or E.M. Forster. And, it's well written, but there's something almost inauthentic about it. And so Carl Muller, suddenly I thought, I may not be able to write as elegantly as Ondaatje, but I can certainly write like a drunken uncle. So I think for me, it was a bit of both. I think the fact that I was on the ground when I was writing really helped me. And I'm not able to write unless I'm in Sri Lanka. I feel that. I need to like smell the air, hear the rhythms of the speech and all of that. So I think it all helps, but ultimately, I think you've got to be on the ground if you're writing about these things. Who do you think screwed us? Well, the Portuguese assumed the missionary position. The Dutch took us from behind. By the time the British came along, we were already on our knees, with our hands behind our backs and our mouths opened. Frankly, I'm glad we were colonized by the British, you say. I suppose, better than being slaughtered by the French, says the priest, or enslaved by the Belgians, or gassed by the Germans, or raped by the Spaniards. Sometimes when I think of the mess this country is in, I think it might be better to let the Chinese or the Japanese buy us over. Let the Yanks and the Soviets own our thoughts, or let the Indians take care of our Tamil problem, like we let the Dutch take care of our Portuguese problem. For me, looking back, it is that sense of we still, 10 years later, when we went through another collapse again, and you kind of wonder, what is the reason? What's the explanation for this? My theory was maybe it's just all the ghosts of our past who are wandering around, who can't get their visa to the next destination, and therefore they're wandering around, disgruntled and looking for justice and whispering ideas in people's ears, and maybe, it seems a plausible explanation. So that was, I suppose that was my way of making sense of it, of this post-war period, but it doesn't seem like the conflicts are over. They always seem to be brewing in the background. We still live in a time where stand-up comedians get arrested, where murderers get pardoned. We still have the dystopia happening there. So I think what fiction does, and look, I lived through COVID, and you realize how non-essential fiction writers are, when society's up against the wall. We're pretty useless at most of times. But I think this is one use that we have, is the fiction writer, there's gaps in our history. There's gaps, like we have a chronicled 2,000-year history. But there are huge gaps in those chronicles, and you can have, depending on who wrote them and all of that. And I think even in our last 40 years, there are gaps in understanding. We have the official reports, we have the histories, and maybe the fiction writer can come in there. There are all these disappearances, and there are theories about them. The Easter attacks is one example. It happened, and it had a certain political impact, and there were lots of theories on it, and I'm sure there'll be novels coming out of it. And I think maybe that's something fiction writers can do. We can go back to the past, and we don't necessarily have to take a side, but we can present the different narratives of the past. And the mixing of fact and fiction, you can still capture the essence of the absurdity of what we did to each other for this long period. And so I think it depends on the type of book you're writing. Some books and some stories I've kept very close to reality and used real names, but with Mali Almeida, I blurred that a lot to make sure that it's understood that this is a fictional story, but that doesn't mean it's not true. You are now sitting in the shadows and breathing in the void. The dead priest sits across from you and whispers into the dark. This island has always been connected. We traded spices, gems, and slaves with Rome and Persia long before history books were invented. Our people today have always been tradable. Look at today. The rich send their kids to London. The poor send their wives to Saudi. European pedophiles sun on our beaches. Canadian refugees fund our terror. Israeli tanks kill our young. And Japanese salt poisons our food. It's certainly part of the Sri Lankan character that, when you go there, even though it's had quite a grim, depressing history, it's not a grim, depressing place. People have that ready smile and that ability to crack jokes, even during the darkest days of our economic collapse and the protest movement called the Aragalaya, where people were on the street, there was no petrol, there was no power, and the jokes never stopped. That's one thing, and I was in Iowa writing my third novel when all this was happening, and I'd go to the internet and you'd see some quite concerning things about the army facing off against students. But the jokes on the internet, the memes, even at the protests, there was a lot of humor in the chants, and I think maybe that's a Sri Lankan coping mechanism, that we kind of like to laugh at the grimness of the gallows humor. I think if I had written a very serious book, and I always start out trying to write serious books, but maybe it would have been difficult to write because this is very terrible history and it goes to some very dark places, and I think the humor is one way of making it enjoyable for me to write, but also hopefully for readers it allows them a way in. So maybe you're attracted to the narrative voice because of the wisecracks, but of course, it's a fine line because there are moments when the jokes have to stop, especially where they visit torture chambers or they go to the front lines, and that's when, yeah, you can't make wisecracks there. But I think mostly it is a good tool, and I think with Sri Lanka we proved humor is a very effective tool against a dictator, against a rich, because that's one thing I noticed. There have been times when we have been afraid to speak out. If you speak out against the government or say something wrong about the war, there was a time where a white man will turn up and you disappear. That became a meme in itself, and we used to joke about that as well. We were at a pub talking, hey, keep your voice down, a white van's gonna turn up. But it's kind of a joke, but it's not really a joke. I know people who were taken by white vans and survived, and certainly no joke. But 10 years later, people were openly mocking that regime through jokes, and I think an authoritarian government doesn't know what to do with jokes. They know what to do with journalists and dissent, but when fiction and jokes, it's a way of smuggling through a message and keeping yourself safe. So maybe that's where it came from, but yeah, there's a lot of humor even in the darkest times in Sri Lanka. It is then that you realize that there is somewhere you have to be, and it is not here, and that if you stay here any longer, you will forget why you arrived. The British sell us guns and the Americans train our torturers. What chance do any of us have? The priest has grown muscular and crawled towards you as she speaks. Her voice doubles, trebles, and then multiplies. You recognize this walk and this growl. You pull away from the shadow and it blocks your exit. The British left us with an unpolished pearl, and we have spent 40 years filling this oyster with shit. It now has its face against yours, and you are no longer sure if it is a he or a she. You feel the cold and the empty roaring through you. His eyes are made from 1,000 other eyes, and her voice is 1,000 other voices. One thing I did notice, a lot of young people come to the readings, and the young people who come there, many of them Sri Lankans, many of them don't live in Sri Lanka, and they tell me, we're aware that a war happened, but our parents don't talk about it. Our teachers don't teach. It's not taught at school. We're taught about ancient history, the kings and the colonial period, but not the last 40 years. And they said this book is the thing that made me realize all these terrible things that happened. And what I tell them is, don't just read my book. There's plenty of much better researched books on this, but you should learn about this. We should talk about it, because I think maybe that's the question at the heart of the book. How does Sri Lanka deal with its past? And that question keeps being raised, and one approach is, do we bury our past and forget about it? And that seems to be the coping mechanism. When you try and engage people with it, it's like, why write about that? Why talk about that? It happened, it was horrible, let's not dredge up those bad memories. But I don't know if that solution works. For me, it's much healthier to acknowledge, to look at the past, scrutinize it, talk about it, if for nothing else to ensure that it never ever happens again. Talking about Dr. Rajini Thiranagama, who was a professor in the Jaffna. So Jaffna is the north of Sri Lanka, which was very much the epicenter of the war. And she published writings about, she documented the atrocities on all sides, on the government side, on the Tamil Tiger side, on the Indian peacekeeping force. And yeah, she was gunned down in her 30s by the Tamil Tigers. And yeah, her daughters were quite young, I think 10 or 8 at the time. And Dr. Rajini has been written about a lot. There's been a lot of films made about her. So I wasn't, but you can see that Dr. Rani is based on this character. But I thought I'd fictionalized it enough. And you're sort of worried as well. What is the family going to think? Are they going to be offended? So it was quite moving when Narmada Thiranagama and I think her other daughter Sharika, I think they're both activists and academics, wrote this and said that, she was quite right. I've never met her mum, but she said she was just as bossy in the afterlife in this book as she was in real life, and she recognized traits, and that she had a dream after reading it that her mother, touched the back of her head. And this is stuff that you don't think about when you're writing these silly ghost stories, that you could have that kind of effect. But yeah, I immediately wrote back to her and said I was very moved by her mother's work and her sacrifice, and it's a wonderful tribute. So whether you believe in an afterlife or ghosts, it is true that what she said is it was a gift for her to see her mother alive in the pages of someone else's book, and maybe that is the power of fiction, that you keep ideas and people alive long after they are gone, hopefully long after I'm gone. I don't know if the book will be in print in 20 years, you never know. With the robots taking over, what's going to happen. But yeah, these are moments that you can't predict, but you have to value and you have to celebrate and appreciate. That hum at the edge of our hearing is not a she or a him or a it or a they. It is a cacophony. Here's the truth. Take a good whiff. We have fucked it up all by ourselves. The Mahakali's arms are around you, and someone else's arms are around you, and everyone's arms are around you. Say it once more, louder and slower. Its teeth are as black as its eyes, and its mouth grows wider, and you see its black tongue and the eyes peering from its throat. Say it once more, louder and slower. We have fucked it up all by ourselves.